Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our final session of the Parallel Event Summit, following the leader, choosing moderators for interaction activities. We'll dive into the good, the bad, and the challenging of moderator experiences and best practices in choosing your moderators for maximum engagement. I hope all of you have took the time to pin yourself on the map with our gamification activities and also do the crossword challenge provided by Engamio. Those are great games, great interactions, and of course, I hope they gave everybody the brain breaks that they needed in between all the sessions. So I'm wondering how many of you were able to ace the crossword puzzle, because I did make the last clue incredibly difficult. So I will be looking at that leaderboard to send reusable straws to anyone who has that top score. So I do encourage everybody to take a look at that. Again, provided by Engamio. Thank you so much for giving us those brain breaks during all the session activity. So I want to jump headfirst into our final content session today about choosing the right moderator for your audience. Our subject matter expert today is Liz Caruso. Liz is the CEO of Texty Talk and has eons of experience in all things events. So welcome, Liz.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
All right, so we're going to jump right in. We're going to start talking about moderators and virtual MCs. So, Liz, we probably incorporate both of these into our events, and we've probably been part of them that have both. But we really want to talk about the common use cases for a moderator and a virtual MC. So, moderators, obviously, you're looking at me. That's what I've been doing with every session. I'm taking you through it. I'm posing questions to our speakers, and making sure we keep our conversation on task and to time. Whereas a virtual MC, they're like your guide, almost like your concierge through your event. So, Liz, we want to talk about some similarities and also some differences with moderators and virtual MCs, just so we can set up what the differences are and where we're really putting moderators into that bucket of what we're choosing for our sessions.
Yeah, so I think some places where they overlap. Well, first of all, the moderators and the MCs have to work really well together. And there's a lot of like back channel communication where, they're often communicating with each other, trying to figure things out. So, your MC, for example, might be ready to introduce a session, but your moderator is not ready, or the speaker for that session is not available or something. So there's a lot of back and forth. And essentially, I think both play a role in keeping the energy level up, in transitioning from one thing to another. And I think it's in that kind of use case that a lot of people get confused that those are two different roles, though,
Yeah.
because you kind of are just thinking like, okay, they're the ones moving the program along. I think where I feel like the difference is that your moderators often are much more like content focused. They usually
Hmm.
have a much deeper knowledge of the content. They spend a lot more time. I see them as like the deep dive, right? They spend
Yeah.
time thinking through the session, doing what you've done so well for today's content, and really like laying out how the conversation is going to go and what are we talking about. Whereas the MC, I think, is more about that like agenda changes and moving us along through the agenda, the high level energy. Um, that's what I would say in terms of like the big differences.
Yeah, and one thing that I just came to mind that I'm sure you'll agree with is when we're trying to save on resources, I'm sure some people will try to make the moderator and the virtual MC the same person. So I think you might agree with me when I say that's a bad idea. Just because, like you're saying, your virtual MC, they're getting programming notes and they're moving you through the environment, and making sure that you're having this great experience. Whereas the moderator is more content focused. They are in the space. They know about the session content and can pose questions and insights. So making those people one and the same, that's a big job, and you're going to take away from some of that experience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's never the ideal scenario, but I also know that that's just the reality a lot of people are working with. And I would
Mhm.
say, even if you have both, you have a virtual MC and a moderator, I would say that your moderators do have to have a little practice and preparation in kicking off the session, similar to an MC. So if you didn't have an MC at all, and it was your moderator who was kind of pushing the agenda through, I mean, there is, even if you had that MC, there's that opening part that I find a lot of moderators are just really awkward at, because they're ready to go really deep and they don't spend the 30 seconds to welcome people, to make them feel comfortable, to make them laugh a
Mhm.
little bit, to introduce themselves, and then to get into the content. So even when you have a great MC, I think your moderators need to be trained a little bit on that side.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, ideally they all stay completely separate.
Yeah, and that's great. And let's dive in, and actually you've got two audience questions already, so I do want to get to them. And when things go wrong, as they do in life, what's the moderator's role? So let's talk about and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this in the session, but what do you see, what are they responsible for when things aren't going well during the live? Where does it kind of, where's the boundary at? So how much do they have to cover or recover in this situation to keep that experience positive?
Well, I would say it depends on what's going wrong, and I think it's up to each event to define that, because I think it depends on the skill set of the different parties. But typically, I would say that if it's like a tech related issue, it's more on the MC to keep things flowing. If it's a speaker not showing up issue, again, the MC is the one who shifts things around and gets your attendees comfortable with the fact that your agenda is changing, for example. However, when you say things go wrong, and I'm thinking about like a moderated conversation, I often think about, you know, your chat going a little too far off topic,
Mhm.
or a person who comes on video and asks a question that's really inappropriate. And your moderators are going to be heavily involved in something like that because they really don't have a choice. So I see that being the line. I think you can easily decide per event that there's different lines and different worst case scenarios. I guess that's part of what we do as event planners, is think about all the things that could go wrong. But I think in general, the moderator is trying to make sure that from a content perspective, it delivers. And
Mhm.
so if that starts to go a little too far off the train, it's their responsibility to bring it back. If people are not engaged and they're just like not participating, it's their responsibility to get people involved somehow, to ask them prompting questions and to call
Mhm.
on people specifically. Whereas I see the MC's role in terms of things going wrong as more like schedule related.
Yeah, yeah, and no, that's great, and a good example of that, I guess, with a moderator would be, and we've all seen it, I'm probably guilty of participating in it as well, is when the session starts and your chat is just all about the weather still after the content has started. So, it's a great responsibility of your moderator to, like you're saying, pose those questions, kind of get it turned around because you want them engaged. I don't wanna hear how sunny it is in Florida when I'm in Chicago and it's 2 degrees. While that's such a commonality that we can find when we're having small talk and
Yeah.
getting ready for something to start. But it very much is a great example of them having to be on point to bring that back to what we're all here for. And have them engage in that content and asking questions. So I think that's great. I do see the other audience question about the characteristics. We're going to talk about that. So I'm going to save that one because we are going to get to that. But Liz, if you would be so kind or so bold to share, and I will too, what are some bad moderator experiences you've seen, and what made them bad?
Well, unfortunately, we've all been there. I think, the worst moderator experiences I've ever been on the planning side of is when someone gets forced into that role.
Hmm.
And either just because of their job title or because they need hands. And so they kind of just like assign staff members to moderate rooms. That typically is an issue for a lot of reasons. I think, one of the most I think especially in virtual, some of the worst things is
Hmm.
that, like, dead air. There's just
Yes.
nothing worse than weird, awkward silence. Not to call you out, Leslie, but we were chatting the other day about,
Yeah.
like, we've all had that experience of, like, "Am I live? Am I is it working?" So, like, there are people who they take that, though, for, like, the first 5 minutes, and you're like, "Guys, we gotta figure this out here."
Hmm.
So whether
Hmm.
it's, like, a technical issue, and I think it could either be that someone is, like, super quiet and very timid in leading the discussion, which
Yeah.
I think is a challenge, or the other side, which is that they're, like, way too talkative and they think they're a speaker or something. And I think there is a big line between moderator and speaker. You want their expertise and you need them to know enough to like drive the conversation, but the whole point is to get the attendees involved, as you are doing with the chat so perfectly.
Yeah, and oh, thank you. And that's, I mean, the what goes along with bad is just like you're saying, sticking somebody in that role without really asking them if it's something they can do or something they'd be comfortable doing. And you made the point that that's just the reality for some people of the resources we're working with. So there may not be any choice there. But you really do want to take a step back and think about that because I used myself and as an example on the last engagement activity where I was thrown into moderating And I was terrible the first few times I did it because they just gave me a script. I read off it. I handed it over to the speaker and I
Yeah.
asked the questions. I didn't try to engage them, but the key point there is too, I was thrown into it without knowing anything about the space. I didn't know anything about the session they were talking about, so I had no chance to add any commentary. So when yes, you're working with limited resources, but take a look at those moderators because if you're just throwing them into it and all you're telling me is I just have to look at the chat, ask the questions and intro them, that's probably all I'm going to do. I'm not going to do much more than that to keep it going if you're basically just ticking off a list of
Yeah.
things I need to do. Um, and that's I mean, that's my example is I've had people where you can just tell they're sitting there reading it and there's
Yeah.
no engagement there. There's reading their script. And then they're typing or answering chat in the background, which is great. But at the same time, they might have missed something that the speaker said that they could pinpoint to you in a chat or in a question. So the the good outweighs the bad. I will say I've whether it's the situation we were put in or not, I've seen much better moderators, much more engagers over the last few years. So do you want to give us a really good example of a really good session you've seen that was moderated perfectly and they hit all the points and it really kept you engaged?
So we have a particular client that does a wide variety of events. Most of them have been in person, and then they, of course, went virtual in 2020. And so we got to see their moderation skills. So they do assign moderators from within their staff, which I think is totally fine. And in this case,
Mhm.
it worked really well because their staff knows the attendees and they know the content. So it wasn't just kind of being thrust into it. There was some training involved. And I think what worked really well is that they have a topic that is cause based, and they're all very passionate about it. And
Mhm.
so they were able to really engage their attendees, and the moderators did such a good job at like. I wouldn't even say calling out people by name because they know their names, you know, so they were just having conversations and using names and making it more personal and also keeping the conversation flowing. I know that for this one client, they were integrating because it was virtual, they were integrating things like Mural and other kind of like collaboration tools, which was really clunky for their moderators. That was something
Mhm.
totally new for them. But they did a training and they did really a really good job of like giving them basic structure, some basic in like training on it so that they weren't completely overwhelmed. And then they didn't
Right.
expect them to just be like doing these fancy things in Mural. It was just kind of like the basic minimum, but it was enough to make that something that was like an integrated part of the conversation.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think that is really important. It's like encouraging everyone to participate, keeping a friendly environment by using people's names and keeping the language casual. I think interview style like this is great because it involves the moderator and lets them kind of drive the conversation as compared to just bringing in your moderators at the end and like having them facilitate
Yeah.
Q&A. So I think, you know, those are some examples of just really great moderation that we've seen.
Yeah, and that's a good point of kind of playing off each other and the moderators and speakers really working closely together because if anybody remembers this, I don't know if I have any DESers in the audience, but myself and Caitlin O'Malley used to host them together. And full disclosure, we are good friends, but it worked because she knew what I was going to say or my opinion about something, and she would challenge that, and it would go back
Mhm.
and forth. And that made it fun and it made it more engaging because I knew what boundaries I could push and what I couldn't. And with some speakers, you may not know that if you haven't worked a lot with them, but I like your client having those passionate people speaking about that, but also having those moderators that are almost as passionate or as passionate as they are about that as well, because that makes them more engaged in it. Too, it's not just a job; it's not just a
Yeah.
role to them.
Yeah.
They really want to get that out there. So that's a great example. I have a question for you that's a really good one. And it's how aggressive should moderators be in getting people to participate?
Okay, so, you know, depends on your audience, of course, that's, like, the standard line, but I guess a few things I would say, I think you need to be a little aggressive because certain audiences just don't feel comfortable, but
Hmm.
I don't really like the word aggressive in general, just not my thing. But even within the context of what we're talking about today, I think it's less about aggressive and more about different techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So, asking people to like put on your video and chat. If I'm not speaking, trust me, my video is off everywhere I go. Like that's always my preference is to be super active in the chat, but I don't want to be on video.
Yeah.
And so I think really understanding like what is it that's trying different things until you figure out like, okay, when I ask them to put something in the chat, suddenly they're doing it. When I ask them
Mm-hmm.
to come on video, there's certain people who do that. And how do I get that working? And then there's kind of the difference between, I think some audiences honestly are just totally bored by really straightforward questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
tell us whether you think it's important. Like, I hate polling in events when they do like, tell us whether you think A or B is more important. And it's like, clearly the answer is A. I want to just
Mm-hmm.
like poke my eyes out. I think a lot of other audiences appreciate the ability to weigh in on something that's highly controversial. And so you could pitch a question in that way and see if you can get a little more engagement. So I don't know if I would say aggressive, meaning don't give up. Don't just
Mm-hmm.
ask a question and assume like, okay, they're not that interested and then move on.
Yeah.
But not aggressive, like, come on, people, put something in the chat. So just try different things until you can get people because either, your content's horrible and people are just checked out completely, meaning their
Mm-hmm.
tab's not even open, or they want to participate. I mean, people would not show up to a virtual or in-person event and not want to participate in any way.
Yeah.
So it's just figuring out like how do they want to participate and how can you facilitate that?
Yeah, and I mean, that's an interesting point because, I'm with you, my video is usually off unless I'm really have a great question that I think is gonna really stand out, but it's interesting because we've been talking a lot today about audience preferences and how they may change, and I'll be honest, I am more apt to ask a question on digital than I am to stand up in a room and do it. So
Oh
it's
yeah,
just we're running the gamut of everybody's preference and what they would do. So I agree. The word aggressive, you probably as a moderator don't want to be seen as aggressive because if I hear through the grapevine that Liz is a super aggressive moderator, you don't want to go to that session because all she's going to do is cold call you. I'm probably not going to go, or I'm really going to hide
exactly.
from you during those participation engagement activities. But like you're saying, I think it's good to not be aggressive, but maybe be just a little bit more like I should. I'll give my advice to myself of keep following up on that question. If you haven't got somebody to respond and it's really important, insightful, maybe give your response first.
Right.
I know everybody hates when somebody answers a question with a question. Like if I ask somebody what their opinion is of something and then they say, well, what is yours? That gets you, it's a circular conversation. So maybe
Yeah.
offering up your response first would get people thinking and a little bit more comfortable as well. So I agree. Maybe not the word aggressive, but just really persistent in getting those people to give those insights and really think about the content that they're attending. So it's a great point and a great example. So we've distinguished the differences between moderators and virtual MCs. So let's get to what everybody wants to talk about, and let's talk about the traits and characteristics of engaging moderators. Because the knowledge and expertise, like we talked about, and Liz, you gave the example of your client being super passionate about their content. That is a really big thing that you need for not only a moderator for a topic, but also engagement activity. If I'm in a medical session and they have me as the moderator and I know zero about what they're talking about, and then I take you into an engagement activity, I am going to give you that bad moderator experience where I'm just throwing out the questions they told me to and waiting for somebody to answer them. And then when they answer, I don't have anywhere to take the conversation because I don't know what they're talking about.
Exactly.
So let's break down. Let's kind of start with that. So how important or how do you think you can look for that in a moderator? How do you measure what knowledge or expertise they have in a topic, or how do you look for that?
So I think it's kind of a combination. I mean, a lot of times when we're working with moderators, they're warm leads to the organization. I mean, they're
Hmm.
not like people you've never heard of. Most of the time, people who are volunteering to be moderators are active members of your community, and you kind of know who they are. So I think that's important. If you don't have that piece, then I think it's a combination of kind of researching background, so things like
Hmm.
LinkedIn, We're going to talk about the form that they might fill out
Yeah.
and asking some strategic questions there to get a sense of what they're passionate about. But I also recommend referrals. Like, you have to talk to other people who've seen them in a moderator type role, whether that's, at an event or in some other scenario, to
Hmm.
understand, because there's like the content piece, but then there's the ability to lead a conversation. That side of things, I think you have to kind of also look at. And then I think really drilling down. So, like, let's say we're talking about, so the client I mentioned earlier, they're on my mind now. So they were talking about maternal health. So, okay, I'm not just looking for a moderator who's passionate about maternal health, but I want someone who's deeply involved in racial, disparities
Hmm.
and what that might do to maternal health. And so I'm going to put a person who's very knowledgeable about that on a related session. And so you don't necessarily need someone who can like span the breadth of a topic, but
Hmm.
actually I think it's better to find those more narrow experts, or just people who are really passionate about something. So they do a lot of reading. They're always like out there trying to find out about that topic. So I think that would be pretty important in terms of evaluating whether or not they could lead a conversation on a particular topic.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because you also sometimes you might get dry speakers who need that moderator pull that out of them to be able to continue that conversation.
Yeah.
So that's key too. But the knowledge and expertise I touch on, because I've had an experience where I hired someone as a moderator for interviews and I didn't really do my full research. And I put them in a strange situation because they couldn't keep the conversation going because they weren't actually active in events in the industry. So I not only did her a disservice, but also the audience because,
Mm.
there was quick questions and then it was over.
Yeah.
So that's so important when you're looking at that. And it really does give your audience, the benefit of getting deeper into those conversations as well if your person is very knowledgeable and has that expertise and adds that commentary. So that is a super important trait. What other traits and characteristics would you look for in a good moderator, or what can you tell us that you look for when you are looking for moderators for your sessions?
Well, I think you brought up a good point actually about the interaction with the speaker. And I think that is individualized. So I couldn't say, it's someone who's like really chatty and
Hmm.
able to come up with questions on the fly. Sometimes it's that. And sometimes a perfect moderator for a session is someone who can like tone things down and slow the pace of things. And that really does come down to knowing your speakers very well and how
Hmm.
they present and how they are, and then also pairing them with a great moderator. And so you might have 3 people who want to be a moderator for a particular session. They might all be great from a content perspective, but maybe one is a better fit for that particular speaker. And so there is a lot of that kind of matchmaking that happens, because I think
Hmm.
another thing that's important is the conversation flowing. So we've talked about that a little bit, but I
Yeah.
think the key here is getting that right balance between the speaker, any kind of engagement activities, like actually getting through the activity itself, and then your attendees being a part of it, and then some of their opinions and knowledge as well.
Hmm.
So I think you have to pay attention to that. I think you want to look at that person's ability to also leverage the technology. I mean, I guess I always have to talk about the technology. You could have a great like person who can speak very well on the topic and is very great at moderating conversation, but we've definitely had moderators who are totally overwhelmed by also looking at the chat that like throws
Yes.
them over the edge, or they forget that there's a whole Q&A tab they're supposed to be looking at, or whatever that might be. So understanding that piece is really important too. What do you need your moderators to do from a technical perspective, and is that
Hmm.
person able to do that? We've actually had to pair like content moderators with a tech person who is there like feeding the moderator the questions, because they really couldn't use the technology, if
Right,
we were being
right.
honest.
Yeah, and, full disclosure, I have my colleague Ron looking at the chat. It's not because 'cause I'm technology challenged, it's because I'm just trying to carry on this conversation. So, but that is a good point because you might get people who are great. They've been in the industry for 20 years, but then you tell them they're going to look at a chat and a QA, and they're also gonna download a resource and share it,
Right.
and it stops there,
It's a
because
lot.
it's challenging. It is a lot, and, you're also, I mean, you're putting that tough task on somebody to carry on this conversation if literally no one is responding to them. It's like I've had plenty of times where I've talked to myself, and giving myself tips because nobody's responding to them. So those are great things to look at. One I want to touch on. Oh, this is great. Whoever just put in this question, this is exactly where I'm going with this. How do you address difficult or disruptive participants? We've all seen it, whether or not we've jumped on the bandwagon and done it too in a chat and followed that person. It is tough because you want to create this welcoming space where people can have opinions and there can be debate, but you also want to be respectful to those attendees and that speaker who's giving you their time and their expertise. So the last thing they want to see is Ron's disagreeing with everything I said, and that kind of throws them off their game. So, Liz, how do you think as a moderator you deal with that, or what are the best tactics of kind of swaying that back to a positive, so that it's not kind of having the domino effect of everybody in that chat jumping on there as well?
So I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about with this. One is the preparation. So I think you need to protect your conversations, your moderators, and your speakers by communicating to your attendees in advance what is expected and what's allowed and what's not allowed. So, you know, for some reason, I'm thinking of like when you join a Facebook group, there are like three little boxes and you have to answer questions or agree to things. And then there's the rules. I have really been starting to think that we need that at events, especially for virtual events, but even in person, to be able to say, like, this is for great discourse. It's not that you can't agree. I
Hmm.
think we should all have that. But, there's no like bullying. And unfortunately, that's a reality of our society, I guess,
Yeah,
not just virtual
yeah.
events for sure. So I think having that, and then I'm a fan of like very tight curation around those rules. So I am not at all against kicking people out of the rooms
Hmm.
or blocking certain people if it became a rule issue and then following up with them separately about why, as compared to handling it in the chat
Yeah.
or in, the conversation. I think the other thing is being able, again, to kind of redirect the conversation is important, just kind of
Hmm.
keeping it positive. I think things like chat is where I often see it go kind of crazy because people can type so fast and I think that's where like muting the person is sometimes better than verbally acknowledging that
Hmm.
it's like, okay, I can mention one or two things they've said and say that we agree or don't agree, but then it becomes to the point where it's like not worth your attendees' time.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's a good point too because people do type fast. I will say there's people typing fast in this, but
Yeah.
it's a horrible feeling for a moderator too when, like I said, it's like a domino effect, and then everybody starts pinpointing that one thing that that person said, and you might get some people who agree with it and some who don't, and then that's what the engagement becomes. It's just talking about this
Yeah.
point that someone made instead of focusing on what the speaker's talking about. So I think that's great advice. I love the handling it outside of that because I will admit myself having run some events in the past as well. I'm a little weaker on kicking people out. It's not something you want to do,
Yeah, of
but if
course.
it gets to the point where it's so disruptive, does that one attendee number really count towards your goal when you're putting it against the benefit and the experience of your other attendees? The answer is no. And it's not worth it. So
Yeah.
I think those are great tactics for that. A great question. I actually want to finish up with this because this is great, and it seems like it could be a piece of content that we could put out to people. Is there a compatibility checklist for pairing moderators and presenters? So, do you have any ideas of things you could really look for when you've got a list of moderators and one speaker, and how you can match them up?
Leslie, I think this is on you. Good question from Joe. Nice to see you, Joe, by the way. No, I don't know of a compatibility checklist. I know from our experience, it tends to be one of those soft skills that event planners have to add to their
Yeah.
own checklist of like knowing all things and making it work manually. I don't know. I think you should put something together.
Yeah, that's thank you, Joe, for giving me a piece of follow-up content. That's great. Yeah, that's a hard one, and I think you're right. It is a soft skill, especially where in our industry we know kind of some of the bigger name speakers. We're all familiar with them, so it's easy to pair up those with people that you know. But when it's a newer speaker coming in, and even you're not that familiar with them, it is a little bit hard to think of people that could be great moderators for them. So I think it comes with look at those personalities. Even if you just met them, just really look at them. One thing I always look at is a sense of humor. I know it sounds like it's not something you need in sessions, but I'm looking at, do you think it's funny that my kid is screaming and running around in the background? Or are you like, what am I going into?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
are you doing? So I think really looking at those certain traits in your speaker, but then also looking at in your moderator. And also, um, do your speakers and moderators, do they both handle curveballs well? Will they be able to take them and run with it and not worry about it? It's certain things like that where it's small personality traits that you wouldn't think of when you're choosing a speaker or a moderator, but that you should now, because they're going to be able to add that flavor and that kind of, let's say, pizzazz into your session and get people to be more comfortable and more relaxed than they would in a formal setting. So Joe, again, thanks for the idea for a piece of content. I'll definitely follow up with you on that. But we are at time. Liz, thank you so much for joining us and giving us all your tips. It's always fun working with you, and I learn so much from you every time, even though I talk to you all the time. There's always something new. So everybody take one more last gamification break. Liz and I are going to come back in the engagement activity at 1:35, and we're actually going to show you a template we've put together of how you could do a form that people can fill out and put that out as a call for moderators, similar to a call for proposals when you're trying to choose through those moderators. So Liz, thank you so much again. We will give everybody a short break and we will be back in just a few moments.